I wanted to jump back to the question before about the proprietary and transparency and link it to work that's going on in modular open systems architecture. The interface designs in modular open system architecture, as the Army has worked on it, basically breaks your system up into government-owned and interface-specified elements which have places for proprietary boxes, right? So that you can still do switch in and switch out, but the proprietary stuff is confined. The implications for the proprietary stuff then is it has to interface according to the rules, number one, and number two, you've got to be able to prove that it does what you want with sort of black box testing. But I think there's a mapping here from the work that's been done in the MOSA world to isolate and use proprietary stuff and still have it upgradable and that's useful in the autonomy arena as well. Okay, so for transparency, the first thing I want to say is we actually like transparency. What we don't like about transparency is the carelessly stated presumption that it's sufficient for what you need. The comment that the previous speaker made, that stakeholder input into what features they want visibility into, is absolutely the point that we want to make. So the transparency is key, and before transparency was a cool world, we were calling for something we called cognitive instrumentation, which we meant the technical ability to look into not only what decisions the AI was making, but how they were making and were they making good decisions for the right reasons, all of which is essential for that. So next slide, please.
There's a remote.
Where?
Sorry.
Is this what I'm supposed to do? Okay. So the point here is we want to develop things that are effective, but we also want to be able to assure the effectiveness and dependability. If we're not sufficiently confident, we're not going to be able to get the systems fielded. And if you can't engender the appropriate trust in end users, they won't use it even if you do field it. There's always going to be some kind of certification or licensure problem. This is what the previous speaker referred to as the auditors. And there's probably going to be many of them. There will be safety, there will be cybersecurity. Should I just switch back to the other mic with that? I like walking around, but maybe that's just not in the cards today. So there's obviously going to be a certification process. There's going to be multiple agents, particularly in DoD systems where you may be butting up against lethal weapon systems. And you need, in addition to regulatory authorities, which will tend to interpret trust or confidence in terms of a deliberative, objective process. You also need trust in the instantaneous Kahneman's type 1 thinking on the part of the users. The state of the art for this in complex systems is called assurance cases. It's something borrowed from the various safety communities, FAA, medical devices, and so forth. It's a structured argument where you assemble the necessary evidence to make a case that something is trustworthy and dependable under a certain set of circumstances in a certain environment, for a certain mission in a certain environment in DoD speak. There are regulatory bodies which already require these sorts of things, especially in Europe. And so the good news is that there's a tremendous body of previous work that can be ported over. The safety cases are the oldest. One of the points I want to return to is that the efforts in DoD now between safety and cybersecurity and performance and so forth tend to be stovepiped. And as autonomous systems break the stovepipes and introduce linkages between the stovepipes, that's going to be increasingly inefficient. As an example, this is one of the ISO standards for assurance cases that's already been promulgated. There's a number of them in Europe. It's less far along in this country. The key element here is, where is it? Is they're talking about top-level claims. This is not yes, it will climb the 5% grade at 30 miles an hour. These are top-level claims cutting across a variety of the features you need to be confident of. So the assurance case requires both evidence and arguments, and this is why the transparency alone is not sufficient. You have to provide the right evidence, you have to provide the evidence that is convincing, but you also have to package it in a way which addresses the concerns of the various stakeholders. And transparency by itself doesn't provide the argument. It may provide the evidence only if, as the previous speaker said, you've talked to the stakeholders and found out what evidence they want, but then the evidence has to be marshaled into an argument. Most of our work in this area has been from the TEV&V perspective, and the outputs of TEV&V should be to provide the evidence that will enable you to assemble these assurance cases. Now, AI and autonomy complicate the assurance cases, largely for the reason I said before, that they cut across the previously stable stovepipes. But for the systems we're talking about, setting aside any desire to define AI or autonomy, for the systems we're talking about complex systems with multiple inputs and multiple courses of action where you can't test exhaustively. The state space is too large. The statistical methods aren't going to suffice. They will be valuable, but they won't suffice. For a DOE approach, you don't know what the factors are in general. And you can't assume smooth responses everywhere. Signe Redfield from NRL talks about the behavior of these systems as being like Swiss cheese. You don't have edge cases just on the edges, you have edge cases throughout. So acceptable behavior during the testing is not enough. This goes back to the cognitive instrumentation. You have to be able to make sure that the decisions are being made for good reasons. And the previous speaker's comments about basically keeping the time evolution of the behavior is also a critical element in being able to assemble an argument for stability going into the future. Wrappers and runtime monitors are an essential piece to this, but you have to bear in mind that they add complexity to the T&E process because there's additional things you must test. So you have to structure your basic systems and your wrappers in such a way that everything gets simpler and simpler as you go along, or you're actually going to make the test and evaluation piece harder rather than easier. And then the human-machine teaming explodes everything in sight because the machines are already unpredictable. People have always been unpredictable, and then there's an interaction term between the two, which further explodes the state space. So we've pounded this point already. The previous speaker certainly alluded to it, but the arguments have to be tailored to the audience. The underlying presumption, which we think has been incorrect in places, is that somehow you can put the trust into the system you're designing. The trust is going to be in the heads and hearts of the other stakeholders outside the program office or development team. So you have to pay attention to who needs to be convinced of what, how confident they need to be, going through the stakes and so forth. What is the concept of operations for using this stuff? And special attention to the scope of the most important features you desire and the potentially catastrophic features you need to avoid. And there will be different arguments for different consumers of the assurance case. I guess I made this point before. You can't build in the trust with transparency alone, and you have to make sure that the system you're building, you can make it trustworthy, but you can't force trust into the system. The trust has to be achieved through interactions with the external stakeholders. So the good news, though, is that this allows you to make trust actionable in ways analogous to what this previous speaker's been trying to implement. You set up a formal assurance case, the model allows you to turn the stakeholders' concerns into actionable behavior, producing the evidence that you need. So instead of sort of the fuzzy notions about trust, this stakeholder needs this sort of evidence with this level of confidence to prove that outcome. And it allows you to do that. Once you've gotten this far, then you're back into a sort of a forward and back type of thing. What are we going to do? Well, we need an assurance case. We can, from what the stakeholder needs to be assured of, we can figure out what evidence we need. We can figure out what measurements need to be done to do that evidence. You can figure out what instrumentation you need to do the measurements, and you can figure out the instrumentation you need to do this. So you can use this to drive your whole investment scheme for your T&E infrastructure. So that's the resource part, and then you sort of run the film backwards when you want to actually make the case. You write down what needs to be. Excuse me. You write down what needs to be done in the assurance case. You derive what are testable requirements. You codify the oracles you're going to test, compare your outputs to, take the measurements, collect the evidence over time. We think the time history is going to be very important in providing people with confidence in these complex systems, and fill in necessary arguments. And then, again, working with the stakeholders, you have to iterate this. There's already a body of practice. I want to shout out to NASA. They've done a tremendous amount of the work in this area. They've been standard for some years in the safety community, and there's a rich literature in this. We've been trying to collect both not just the literature, but the tools that are starting to be propagated. Commercial tools are available in some places. There's academic tools that have been developed that are sort of available for free. So there's already a lot of the infrastructure at execution and maintenance of the assurance cases. I want to go back to the stovepipe issue. Eliminating the stovepipes is going to be necessary partly for an efficiency reason. The exploding state space is going to make the T&E for these autonomous systems much more difficult, and you buy back some of that with an assurance case approach, which allows you to collect the evidence once, even if it's going to be used multiple times. And that's one of the points about this. So we want to do this to make this efficient. The assurance case provides you a framework. The next step in the assurance cases is, and there are some who have started on this, the next step in the assurance cases is to expand the structure so they deal with multiple issues at the same time. At the moment, they're sort of, they're either safety or cybersecurity. I think I have to say I've been blabbing often enough, so here's the bottom line at the bottom. The assurance cases are going to require simultaneous arguments from multiple stakeholders. They're all going to have to be satisfied more or less at the same time. Safety, security, cybersecurity, effectiveness, dependability, getting along with allies, who knows how much. Formulating and gathering the evidence to support these things will require early planning and integrated efforts. But almost any talk you go to here, they're calling for earlier planning on this. And the good news is the methods and tools already exist to support this. They're going to have to be expanded and modified to do multiple issues at the same time. But we need to integrate them and use them in our practices, and this has started happening out in the field. To my knowledge, there's been no mandates or specifications from headquarters, but we believe that a structure like this is where we're going to have to go, and there is some groundswell of use of this stuff out in the field where people are actually trying to develop these systems. And thank you very much.
Any questions? Are there any questions on? Oh, yep. Come up, form a line.
Hi, Ross Keener, Infotech again. Do you know if folks in the Air Force that deal with airworthiness, are they up to speed on these assurance cases and this approach?
I think either very much so or adjacent to people who are, because the FAA processes, which are used in part by the Air Force, are closely related to this. In Europe, a lot of the European FAA is mandating assurance case formats for it. But the notion of a structured argument with specified evidence of high quality is, that's the way the FAA has been doing it for a long time. They have not mandated that it be in a sort of an assurance case format, but it's a very related thing, and kind of we don't really care whether you call it an assurance case or not. But it's very much that. We had one of the NASA talks indicated that at times the senior leadership of some of the companies is more concerned with making the safety case to the regulators than they are with keeping their own engineers happy. So I think in the airworthiness area, it's much further along than much of what we do.
Sam McGregor, also Afotech. Wow, that's actually really loud. So you're talking about all these commercial tools that they're available. What tools are you talking about? Where can we find them?
Someplace in here, there should be a partial list. Let me see what we got here. No, that's not going to help any. Okay, yeah, so this is tools for the development of the assurance case. If you send us a request for the developmental test office, we have two small projects. One is to collect a list of tools and what part of the assurance case problem they're aimed at, and the other is collect a tentative list of programs which would be suitable for using this to help accelerate the program and make the testing more efficient. It's in progress, but we'd be happy to share it with anybody once it comes along. So if you send us a note, we can send you what we've got now, and we'll send you a nice, pretty thing with a cover in a few months.
So should people reach out to you directly, or is there a general communications person at IDA that they should?
I'm fine.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Any other questions? Skype? Okay. I have a question. So in my field, I work a lot with subject matter experts who don't know much about machine learning beyond pop culture understanding of machine learning, and that has either led them to be a little bit too trusting in machine learning or absolutely horrified by it. Do you have any advice for where to begin to talk to people like that, making sure that they have realistic expectations of AI and machine learning, as well as maybe encouraging them if they're concerned about it?
So my thought about this would be, and there are pieces of this, is sort of tutorials about strengths and weaknesses, right? One of the talks talked about not falling into the trap of thinking that machines think like we think, right? But I think people drive cars without any understanding of internal combustion engines, right? But there's sort of some level of understanding of the performance, what the dangers are, where they're likely to show up, which is harder because of the Swiss cheese effect, right? But I think there's going to be a general education level that will go on within the community, which will help this. There's a lot of articles. I don't know what's actually the best about it. I think to some extent, I've forgotten the author, but any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's still where we are for much of the thing. So the issue is to demystify it, right? This kind of machine learning is basically regression analysis. You sort of know how that works. You sort of know where it can go wrong, right? But we're still feeling our way. I mean, the example I use often is aerodynamics, right? Aerodynamics is easy by comparison because you know where all the trouble's going to be. It's going to be between Mach 0.9 and Mach 1.1. Maybe a little bit of trouble at the boundary layer separation. Until you've got either the theory or the experience base which tells you where to look for those things, everybody's going to be a little bit tentative about it, and appropriately so.
Thank you. Are you okay with people taking a photograph of this slide if they want to for,
Sure.
okay.
Yeah, this is all public release.
We'll leave it up for a second. Any other questions? We have time.
And I think it should be in.
It should be in the
package on a
materials.
clip.
Okay. All righty. Any other questions? Okay. Then join me in thanking him again.